was one of the first. He gets the credit for inventing it, but he was right there with about 3 or 4 other guys at the same time developing this machine. And that's 1834, and you can see it would have taken a team of horses or oxen, because it operated at a fairly slow speed, and then someone else to operate the animals, and then someone else to stand on the bed and remove the grain that fell off. All these reaping machines have some version of what's called a reel, which typically touches the very tip of the head of the grain, bending it into the blade so it cuts. You know how when you're trying to cut something, if you bend it a little bit, it cuts a lot better? That's essentially what that did. So you'll see that in a lot of the early reapers, and then later on, some of the self-raking reapers. So this is not a self-raker. You know, everything it cuts falls onto the bed, and then it's someone's job to rake it off into gavels, as they called it. And then typically women would follow behind and gather up the gavels. Using the grain itself, they would tie bundles, set the grain up into what are called shocks or stooks to finish drying in the field. There's a whole technique to that. And once the grain was ready to be harvested or dry enough, it would then be transported to a storage area, typically a barn, where it would be, in the days before machines, would be hand threshed over the course of typically the winter. And that meant using something that looks very much like a nunchuck, a flail, which is 2 sort of elongated pieces of rounded wood with a leather strap in between, and you would walk in a circle, sort of turning it, getting the flat side of the wood to hit the heads of the grain, to break open the grain, release the grain berries, and separate it from the straw. Then every so often you would have to rake all the loose stuff off, gather up the grain, which would be full of stuff, and then flail that, winnow that, which is sort of using a tarp or a basket to throw it up in the air and have the wind sort of carry away the extra garbage or the chaff that's in the grain. The threshing floor in a typical 19th century barn is the second floor that someone elevated. So even on the stillest of days, you get some sort of breeze moving through there. Typically, you'll see these barns that have a great big opening to go in and out, but then would have another door off the back that you could open up to let the air go all the way through. And it took forever. So it was a very slow process, especially if you were planning to take grain to market. A lot of people would have grown for their own needs or for their immediate market, but the scale of it was so small, it was hard to do that. So thus comes these machines that speeds up the rate in which you can cut the grain. The next step was something that you needed to clean it faster. And then we've got some examples. Let's see, over here.
How many people worked within that system?
It was typically, different parts of it were different.
Right.
The harvesting, all the hands you could get for harvesting to get it done as quickly as possible. Threshing was done often as a community kind of thing, where people would get together and help each other do that. So it was made into a social event. So corn husking was that way before mechanization. Threshing was that way. You would have a threshing bee or whatever. People would get together and help people do that, and then move on to the next farmer and share the labor that way. So that was not uncommon if you lived in a community where that could happen. We talked about the self-raking reaper. Here's an example of that, where a mechanism was added to the drive train that not only ran the cutter bar back and forth, but you have a combination of a reel that's pushing the grain in, and then a mechanism that's timed to drop a rake to the right level to push everything off the bed. That eliminated one person in the process of the actual harvesting. You still had to walk behind, gather up the grain, and make it into the gavels and the stooks. So this technology goes all the way from the 1850s until the 1870s, in some cases the 1880s. What replaces that, when these two lived side by side for a time, was the binder. The binder, which is pretty much a technology that existed all the way into the 1920s and 30s. You can see all the familiar parts. There's the cutter bar that's going to do the cutting, but instead of going onto the bed and being pushed off, there's a series of canvases that's also being driven by the drive gear there that flattens out the grain, pulls it up through this mechanism here, and wraps a twine around it, ties a knot, and then kicks it out the back in an already tied gavel.
This was true, so.
At that point, then you still need to go through and pick it up and set it up in the field so it's going to dry appropriately. But this was a huge step over this, and this eliminated, yet another step in the process. The first ones of these, the first development, used wire, which was not such a good thing, especially as this technology is developing over here. So that was a short-lived thing. Then the twine took over, and that pretty much stayed at the course for a very long time. What this did, and this combined, put out of work a huge group of itinerant farmers or workers who would come and work the fields because they there was no need for all the labor that they used to provide because it was all being done by this particular machine. So on the end of the 19th century, you're reading about hobos and these vagrant people that rode the rails and things. A lot of those were these unemployed farm folks that had been put out of business because of this improved technology. And there were people in parts of especially in England, that were against that, and they would smash machines and do all kinds of things because it was changing society. But the binder really was a huge step forward. Now, right along with this, and let's go around to the other side.